Hello and welcome back, my YouTube audience. I'm the Crime Whisperer, and tonight, I'm here to guide you through another dark and gripping tale. I know many of you use these stories to unwind and fall asleep, so before we begin, moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, settle in, let the world around you fade away. Let's begin. Case 1. Miguel Fantasma Rivera. Day Ghost. Kingpin, our first story tonight is about a man who, on paper, never existed. No birth certificate, no school records, no medical files. Just whispers, hushed voices in the underworld of drug trafficking and human smuggling. His name was Miguel El Fantasma Rivera, a ghost both in presence and in reputation. Those who knew of him didn't speak openly. His name alone carried weight, from the deserts along the US-Mexico border to the icy corners of New York and the sunlit streets of California. Rivera's empire spread like smoke, possible to grasp, impossible to stop. Unlike the flashy cartel bosses who showed off their riches with exotic cars and golden mansions, Rivera chose invisibility. He didn't crave the spotlight. He thrived in the shadows. He used forged identities, moved constantly, and only communicated through trusted messengers. And yet, from the depths of secrecy, he built one of the most elusive and powerful criminal networks in modern American history, the rise of a ghost. Rivera's ascent began in the early 2010s. He started small, moving cocaine and heroin through hidden desert trails in Texas and California. But as cartel violence surged, and his rivals were either killed or arrested, he moved in carefully, strategically. Then came a shift. He expanded into human smuggling, more profitable, and in many ways, even more horrifying. Migrants from Central and South America were promised safe entry into the US, but what they got was anything but freedom. Many were sold into modern-day slavery, sweatshops, agricultural fields, underground brothels. At the same time, Rivera's drug network was flooding American cities with deadly substances. But he didn't rely on boats or hidden trucks. He used the system itself, commercial logistics companies, private jets, and even unsuspecting delivery drivers. His poison moved through corporate supply chains straight into the streets of Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, and beyond. But Rivera's greatest weapon, corruption, customs officers, police, government officials, some looked away for money, others worked for him outright. With every bribe, every cover-up, every silenced informant, his empire only grew stronger. The fall begins a simple mistake, but no criminal remains untouchable forever. Rivera's undoing didn't come from a dramatic shootout or high-speed chase. It began with a forgotten phone. In 2018, a low-level courier was arrested in Arizona. His phone left unlocked contained encrypted messages that traced back to Rivera's organization. Federal agents pounced. The trail was faint, but it was there. Financial transactions, communication patterns, supply routes. One by one, the pieces were assembled. It took over a year. Surveillance, wiretaps, sting operations. A manhunt, unlike anything federal agencies had mounted in years, with the FBI and Interpol all involved. Eventually, Rivera, once untouchable, began to lose his grip. His safe houses were raided. His trusted lieutenants flipped. The fortress of shadows he had built over a decade began to collapse. The capture in 2019. The chase ended not in some remote jungle or bunker, but in a crumbling home in a quiet Florida town. SWAT stormed the property, expecting the legend. Instead, they found a gaunt, exhausted man, hollow-eyed, broken, alone. Miguel El Fantasma Rivera, the ghost who haunted law enforcement for years, was finally in custody. His arrest didn't bring closure, only a pause. Thousands of trafficking victims remained missing, still suffering in the system's blind spots. Families continued to bury loved ones lost to drugs laced with fentanyl and synthetic poisons. and the black market economy he helped build still churned. Rivera may have fallen, but his legacy lingered. Inside the interrogation room, in a cold, windowless room, Rivera sat shackled to a steel table. His skin, once tanned by years spent crossing deserts and jungles, was now pale under flickering lights. His eyes, once razor-sharp, looked sunken and hollow, but he said nothing. He knew this game. He had played it better than anyone. He bribed, threatened, and erased anyone who posed a risk. And even now, behind bars, he knew his network could continue without him. Yet for the first time in his life, the illusion of control was slipping. The origins of the ghost. To truly understand Rivera's rise, you have to go back. He was born in Coloa, Mexico, sometime in the late 1970s. His early life was steeped in violence and poverty. The drug trade wasn't a choice, it was survival. As a teenager, he began as a mule, ferrying small packages of heroin across the border. But Rivera had bigger ambitions. He studied everything: how others failed, who to trust, when to disappear, and most importantly, how to stay invisible. By the early 2000s, Rivera had erased himself from the system. No paper trail, no digital footprint, only encrypted messages, untraceable couriers, and a growing empire. The full scope of his crimes, Rivera's operations, extended far beyond drugs. His human smuggling ring generated billions. Migrants didn't just disappear at the border, they were harvested for labor. In California fields, in urban brothels, in counterfeit factories tucked behind legitimate storefronts. He was also among the first traffickers to recognize the power of fentanyl imported from China, synthesized in clandestine labs, and mixed into pills, powders, and street drugs. Cheap, potent, deadly. It became his most profitable and most devastating product. Conclusion: the ghost's shadow Miguel El Fantasma Rivera is now serving multiple life sentences, but his name still echoes in the dark alleys of organized crime, because his story is more than one man's fall. It's a chilling reminder that for every ghost who vanishes, another is waiting to rise. The poison in the veins of a nation. By the late 2010s, the effects of Rivera's empire were devastating. Fentanyl, addictive, cheap to produce, and deadly in microdoses, had swept across the United States like wildfire. Overdose deaths skyrocketed. Hospitals were overwhelmed with cases of fentanyl poisoning. Communities were collapsing under the weight of an invisible enemy, and Rivera's product was fueling the crisis. Despite a nationwide crackdown, he remained out of reach. Why? Because Rivera always seemed to be one step ahead, a system built to evade the law. Rivera's greatest weapon wasn't violence, it was foresight. He had insiders everywhere, from immigration offices to border patrol to specialized narcotics units. Every time authorities closed in, Rivera had already moved on. Major raids that should have crippled his network, they barely made a dent, because he always knew when and where to vanish. His distribution channels were unlike anything law enforcement had ever seen. He didn't rely on back-alley drug runners or suspicious cargo trucks. Instead, he embedded his products, drugs trafficking, victims, and illicit materials within legitimate businesses. Commercial airlines, shipping companies, warehouse facilities, everything hidden in plain sight. And while he smuggled lives and poison across borders, he also laundered money with surgical precision. Offshore accounts, real estate portfolios, cryptocurrencies, shell companies masquerading as small businesses. Even when assets were seized, investigators found that most of Rivera's fortune was already gone, buried beneath layers of corporate fog and international loopholes. The fatal mistake. But for all his caution, Miguel Rivera made one fatal mistake. He trusted the wrong man. In 2018, one of his closest lieutenants, Hector Valdez, was arrested in Texas. Valdez had grown tired of the paranoia, the danger, and Rivera's increasing obsession with control. He wanted out, and under the protection of federal agents, he turned Valdez became the government's most valuable informant. He gave them everything: locations of stash houses, names of compromised officials, coded delivery routes, even shipping, schedules for drug-laced cargo. For the first time, law enforcement had a direct link to El Fantasma. The net closes in with Valdez's intel. The noose began to tighten. Raids hit key safe houses. Front businesses were shut down, and Rivera's assets, at least those in reach, were frozen. For the first time in years, Rivera wasn't walking ahead of the law. He was running from it. His final days as a free man were frantic. He moved from safe house to safe house, using forged documents, altering his appearance, and making desperate calls to salvaged contacts. But the empire was unraveling, and time was running out. The capture, the ghost fades. It ended in 2019, quietly, in a faded house tucked away in rural Florida. There were no shootouts, no dramatic escapes. When the SWAT team entered, they didn't find a man ready to fight. They found a ghost team, worn down, sitting alone in the dark, defeated, drained. Don Miguel El Fantasma Rivera, the man who had haunted two nations for nearly 2 decades, had finally been caught. But law enforcement knew this wasn't the end. Rivera's arrest may have weakened the organization, but the roots of his empire still ran deep. The drugs hadn't disappeared. The trafficking hadn't stopped. The corruption hadn't been erased. And for every kingpin that falls, there's always another waiting in the wings. Inside the prison walls, but still in control, Rivera now sits in a high-security federal prison. The media hailed his arrest as a landmark victory. Newspapers called him the architect of a global shadow empire. Cable networks aired specials. Journalists begged for interviews, and former allies vanished. But behind that reinforced cell door, Rivera simply watched and waited. Because he had spent years preparing for this, he had trained his inner circle to operate independently. He had built layers of redundancy. He had hidden funds in places no court order could reach, even in captivity. The wheels of his machine continued to turn. A criminal empire like no other. What made Rivera different from other cartel leaders wasn't just his ability to disappear. It was how he treated crime, not as power, not as revenge, but as business. While others launched violent turf wars, Rivera kept a low profile. He focused on infrastructure, embedding his products into global supply chains. He paid for political influence, ensuring legislation stayed friendly to his interests. And he expanded his reach beyond the Americas. He had connections in China where synthetic opioids were produced, alliances in South America where coca plantations thrived under his financial protection, and networks in Eastern Europe. Trafficking rings provided a steady stream of human cargo. Law enforcement, for years, had underestimated him. They focused on drug busts and border crossings, but Rivera's true power was never in a single route or product. It was in his ability to evolve. The new era, the ghost, leaves a legacy with Rivera gone. A void opened at the top of his empire. But unlike traditional cartels that crumbled after a leader's fall, Rivera's structure had already accounted for it. His design was decentralized, his operatives autonomous, his funding diversified, and so the question wasn't whether his network would survive, it was who would step in to lead it. Because Rivera was never just a man, he was a method, a blueprint, a ghost with a legacy that refused to die. The succession, a hydra, not a throne. Unlike traditional cartels that revolve around a single leader, Rivera's organization had no clear chain of succession. Instead, it was designed like a hydra, multiple heads, each capable of acting on its own. Semi-autonomous factions controlled different parts of the empire, ensuring that even if one fell, the others would continue. After his arrest, 3 key figures rose from the chaos. Dr. R.L. Serrano Morales, once a respected chemist, now infamous for engineering synthetic opioid. He refined fentanyl into more potent, harder-to-detect formulas. fueling a wave of overdoses that crippled cities across America. Isabella Ladama, Dianoba Bega, a trafficking specialist whose web spanned continents, from Central America to Europe and beyond. She exploited both legal and illegal migration systems, moving people invisibly through customs and borders. And Victor El Cielo Salazar, Rivera's most trusted enforcer. He commanded the distribution network across North America, forging powerful ties with biker gangs, prison crews, and local syndicates to ensure the streets remained saturated with Rivera's products. These three didn't seek to replace Rivera. They intended to divide his empire and build their own kingdoms from the pieces. Law enforcement strikes back in the wake of Rivera's arrest. The U.S. government escalated its crackdown. New task forces were assembled. Warehouses were raided. Corrupt officials, once protected by silence, found themselves exposed. International forces joined in. Chinese agencies cracked down on synthetic opioid labs. European law enforcement intercepted trafficking routes. South American governments seized cocaine shipments connected to Rivera's former trade routes. But for every arrest, every seizure, there was another shipment in motion. The black market economy didn't shrink. It simply adapted. Demand didn't disappear. And in the shadows, supply remained relentless. The trial, justice, or symbolism. Rivera's trial became one of the most closely followed legal sagas in recent history. Prosecutors painted him as the architect of mass suffering responsible for thousands of deaths, countless ruined lives, and a global network of exploitation. The courtroom overflowed with media, agents, former operatives, and survivors. Some spoke in hushed tones. Others testified through tears. Rivera remained emotionless, clad in a suit that hung loosely on his diminished frame. He listened in silence as his life was unwrapped, piece by piece. There would be no plea deal, no second chance. And when the verdict came, life in prison. No parole. Rivera showed no regret, because he understood something few others did. As long as there was demand, someone would always supply. The verdict, a public victory, a private reality. The gavel struck, and just like that, an era had ended. News outlets declared the fall of a ghost, the collapse of one of the most sophisticated drug and trafficking networks in the modern world. But Rivera, now shackled and escorted away, allowed himself a faint smile, because he knew the truth. His imprisonment changed the scenery, not the system. The machine he had built, with its decentralized web of operatives and independently functioning factions, wasn't going to collapse overnight. It was too embedded, too profitable, to protect it. Rivera's absence simply opened the door for evolution, a new criminal order. With Rivera gone, the criminal underworld braced itself, but this was no violent collapse, no civil war among rival factions. Rivera had seen to that long before his arrest. He had deliberately ensured that no single person held all the power. Each part of his empire, drug production, trafficking, weapons, laundering, and corruption, was overseen by different figures operating independently, but aligned by profit. This compartmentalization wasn't a flaw, it was the foundation. Now, each former lieutenant began carving out their domain. Dr. Morales ramped up production, testing new synthetic blends deadlier than fentanyl, harder to trace. Labs buried deep in cartel-controlled territories began producing. Shipments set to hit us streets within weeks. La Dama Vega expanded her trafficking web, tapping into war-torn regions and collapsed economies to find new victims. She now ran routes through Eastern Europe, Africa, and Southeast Asia, using diplomatic blind spots and refugee systems to mask her operations. Victor Salazar, ever the strategist, solidified new partnerships with international smugglers, using encrypted platforms and layered shell companies. He moved millions through real estate, crypto, and shadow banking channels. Each one had something to prove. Each one wanted a legacy. and none of them were about to let Rivera's name be forgotten. The ghost still speaks, though Rivera was now behind bars. His presence hadn't vanished. He had spent years cultivating loyalty. He didn't need to speak to be heard. A book placed in a prison library, a line embedded in a legal document, a phrase uttered in a call nascent to most, but meaningful to those who knew. He had mastered the art of coded command. From within his high-security cell, he fed disinformation to authorities, leading them toward rival factions. Away from his own, he manipulated the media with false stories, creating noise to hide real movements, and he coordinated retaliation against former allies who dared step out of line, violent reminders that the ghost still pulled strings, a legacy that refused to die. Rivera had built an empire not based on bloodshed alone, but on structure, patience, and vision. Now, even locked away, he remained a myth unto law enforcement. He was a captured king. To the underworld, he was a legend, still whispering in the dark, because Rivera's greatest creation was never the drugs, it was never the money, it was the system, a self-sustaining empire, and as long as demand existed, as long as desperation, addiction, and power still had buyers, his ghost would never truly vanish. Even from a prison cell, Rivera was still the one pulling the strings. He understood the reality of his situation. His freedom was gone, but the empire he had built, that was a different story. If anything, his capture had only solidified his legend. Authorities had expected his arrest to trigger a collapse. Instead, they watched in disbelief as drug overdoses soared, trafficking routes multiplied, and organized crime adapted faster than they could respond. Without Rivera at the helm, there was no single enemy left to chase. What they were facing now was something far more dangerous: decentralized, self-sustaining criminal ecosystem. For every trafficking cell dismantled, another emerged. For every drug shipment seized, others slipped through undetected. Rivera had designed a network that could survive him, and it did. That was the part that kept law enforcement awake at night. They hadn't captured a man, they had captured a myth. But the machinery of his empire kept turning. Inside his high-security cell, Rivera was under no illusion. Time was no longer his ally, not in the way it is for most prisoners who spend their years counting days on the wall, praying for parole. No, for Rivera, time was moving differently. His creation was evolving beyond him, and soon, it might not need him at all, but he had one last move. Rivera had spent years hiding his wealth in offshore accounts, shell companies, cryptocurrency, wallets, and real estate portfolios, none of it traceable, none of it touchable. The people managing that wealth were not drug runners or gangsters. They were lawyers, financial strategists, and accountants, people who had never seen the inside of a prison cell, and never would. And now, Rivera would pass the torch. Not to the old lieutenants. Many of them were greedy, short-sighted too, obsessed with their own power. Rivera had picked someone else, someone different, a successor who understood systems, not violence, a child of the digital age, not a killer, not a smuggler, but someone far more dangerous. They didn't need guns to take over the empire. They had code, algorithms, and access. While authorities fought shadows in the streets, something new was rising. Drugs still flooded cities, but now distribution moved through encrypted marketplaces, impossible to trace. Human trafficking networks adapted too, no longer relying on border crossings, but on forged identities, data breaches, and AI-powered logistics. And the money, it no longer sat in stacks, in cartel safe houses. It was embedded in global commerce, intertwined with legitimate corporations, camouflaged in investments and corporate funds. To unravel it now would mean collapsing entire industries, and that was Rivera's true genius. His greatest crime wasn't trafficking or violence, it was corruption. A system designed not just to break laws, but to bend the very foundations of law itself. While other cartels ruled through bullets and blood, Rivera ruled through silence and strategy. He built his empire in the shadows of global business, wearing suits instead of scars, and working with people who had never fired a shot but could move billions with a phone call. Even after his capture, his influence remained untouched. Private security firms, unknowingly funded with cartel money, still operated in war zones. Pharmaceutical supply chains still ran through facilities tied to his ghost network and his wealth. It lived on the blockchain hidden behind encrypted ledgers no government could crack. They thought they had one. They thought locking him up was the end. It wasn't. Rivera had always known that empires don't live forever, but ideas outlive kings. What he built was never just about him, it was about building a criminal network that looked nothing like the old cartels and everything like modern enterprise. It was adaptable, invisible, indispensable. So, while his name faded from headlines, the real empire, the one hidden in the bones of the global economy, continued to grow. And Rivera, he simply watched, because the world had made a fatal mistake. They thought he was the empire. But the empire was never built on Rivera. It was built on a vision. And visions don't die, they thought. Rivera's empire ended the day he was locked in a cage. They were wrong. Major shipping conglomerates unknowingly ferried his poison across the world. Fentanyl, hidden inside crates labeled as medical equipment. Billion-dollar investment firms held shares in legitimate corporations quietly controlled by Rivera's ghost network, funneling billions into his system without ever realizing the source. Even humanitarian organizations, desperate for funding, had accepted donations from charities Rivera had set up years ago, turning cartel money into clean goodwill. The irony: some of the very politicians who championed Rivera's arrest had signed infrastructure deals with subsidiaries he created. His reach wasn't just criminal, it was systemic. While global law enforcement celebrated the takedown of a cartel kingpin, Rivera's true operation had already evolved. His empire no longer needed border mules or jungle runways. It had digitized, synthetic opioids 3D printed, molecularly engineered to bypass regulation, were sold through encrypted dark web markets that no border patrol could intercept. Human traffickers became obsolete. His network now hacked immigration systems, generating fully legal IDs that made their clients appear as legitimate travelers. Where once suitcases of cash crossed continents, Rivera's wealth now moved through decentralized finance platforms, stored in crypto wallets and blockchain vaults that no government could trace. And every crackdown, every new law, every attempt to tighten the net, Rivera's successors found ways to use them. Regulations became loopholes. Borders became distractions. He had built something unstoppable. From his prison cell, Rivera had one advantage: left patience. He didn't need to lift a finger. The system he designed had become autonomous, self-correcting, too vast to kill. He didn't need to speak. His empire no longer needed his face, his orders, or even his name. They imprisoned the man, but the ghost of his empire still ruled the world. Case to Javier el Fantasma Morales, a man who didn't exist, not officially. No fingerprints, no photographs, no confirmed nationality, just a name whispered in fear through the criminal underworld. For nearly 20 years, Morales operated like a shadow stretched across two continents, from the jungles of Colombia to the ports of Los Angeles. His empire flourished, not through brute force, but through precision. He wasn't just a trafficker, he was a strategist, a logistical mastermind who realized that in the 21st century, the most valuable commodity wasn't drugs or weapons, it was people. His organization, known only by its internal code name, Operas Nocturna, moved thousands of humans across borders every year. Some were desperate migrants who willingly paid for passage. Others were kidnapped, forced into servitude, or sold into industries darker than death. Many were women and children, promised jobs, but delivered into nightmares and drugs. They were just an added bonus. The same routes used to traffic people became pipelines for heroin, fentanyl, and methamphetamine. Morales profited from every layer of pain, addiction and desperation, suffering and silence. By the early 2010s, his network had reached near mythic status. He had infiltrated port authorities, bribed officials, and manipulated politicians. His digital infrastructure was impenetrable, encrypted communication, cryptocurrency accounts, and shell corporations across 3 continents. His empire was structured like a virus, cellular, adaptable, and designed to survive any attack. Even when a branch was compromised, the body remained intact. Each shipment disguised as something innocent. Trucking companies, fishing enterprises, even fake humanitarian aid. But behind every legitimate face was a darker reality. Violence wasn't his main tool. Control was. Those who defied him didn't die. Their families did. Or worse, they were crippled under debt and psychological torment. Fear, not bullets, kept people loyal. But as his empire expanded, so did the eyes watching him. The first real lead came in 2016, when a low-level operative in Miami gave authorities a crack in the wall, a series of offshore banking transactions tied to a quiet agricultural firm in Mexico. That led to over 100 shell companies spread across the Caribbean, Asia, and Europe, all secretly pumping billions into Morales's global machine. Then came the break. A shipment intercepted in Texas, marked as medical supplies, was found to contain hidden fentanyl. But more importantly, inside the truck was a coded manifest. Once decrypted, investigators uncovered something horrifying. Names, ages, destinations, human cargo. Dozens, maybe hundreds. It confirmed what some had feared. Morales wasn't just trafficking drugs. He was moving lives at scale. Even with mounting evidence, Morales remained a phantom, constantly on the move. Safe houses in Argentina, Serbia, Hong Kong. His last known appearance was in a Dubai resort, meeting businessmen who, knowingly or not, were helping him launder his billions. What finally brought him down wasn't bullets or raids. It was a glitch, a trace anomaly in cryptocurrency transactions, an overlooked discrepancy that pointed to a Swiss banker. A multinational sting followed. Warehouses were seized. Associates flipped. Morales's network began to unravel, and then, a final misstep, in December 2017. As his empire collapsed, Morales tried to flee to Russia using forged asylum documents. But someone inside his circle betrayed him. When his private jet landed in Istanbul to refuel, Turkish agents working with Interpol, and thus authorities moved in. The ghost was caught. His trial became a global spectacle. Survivors testified. Billions in assets were traced. The scale of his operation shocked even hardened prosecutors. Morales never spoke a word during the proceedings. Some say he still held secret codes, bank accounts, names of powerful allies. Others believe he didn't need to say anything, because just like Rivera, Morales had built something that no cell could contain. But even ghosts eventually leave footprints, and in the end, the empire he ruled from the shadows was dismantled piece by piece until only a warning remained. A lesson carved in silence, a legacy of darkness. The age of the cartel kingpins may be over, but the age of invisible empires has only just begun. His arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. For decades, Javier El Fantasma Morales had been untouchably myth-whispered in fear by traffickers and law enforcement alike. His capture wasn't just a win. For justice, it was a seismic shift in the balance of power. But what followed revealed the terrifying depth of the empire he'd left behind. In the weeks after his arrest, intelligence agencies around the globe scrambled to piece together the sprawling remains of his criminal syndicate. Morales had been the architect, but the machine he built was designed to run without him. Independent cells, global smuggling routes, and thousands of victims were still caught inside the cold, humming engine of his operation. The first challenge was financial. Morales didn't hide his billions in offshore accounts or safes tucked in villas. His fortune was buried beneath layers of shell companies, cryptocurrency wallets, and luxury assets spread across continents, from Hong Kong penthouses to hidden villas in the Cayman Islands. Investigators followed the money trail through high-end art auctions, diamond smuggling rings, and fake real estate companies tied to hotels, airlines, and international shipping. In many cases, the CEOs and business owners running these ventures had no idea they were cogs in a criminal machine. Morales' brilliance lay in his ability to create distance, making sure he was never connected directly to the crimes. But money was only half the story. The greater horror was the people across Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. Thousands of individuals remained trapped, human cargo caught mid-transit in a system that no longer had a driver. Many had been lured with promises of opportunity. Instead, they were forced into labor camps, sweatshops, or worse. The most vulnerable were women and children. Their fates sealed the moment they were taken. The darkest discoveries came from the US-Mexico border, where Morales had developed one of the most advanced smuggling infrastructures in modern history. Tunnels, stretching for miles, equipped with lights, ventilation, and even rail systems. Some had been active for over a decade, hidden beneath warehouses and abandoned lots. When agents raided one tunnel near El Paso, Texas, what they found was chilling. Behind the facade of a crumbling warehouse, they uncovered a vast underground labyrinth. In its depths, dozens of people, locked in makeshift rooms. Some had been there for weeks, starved, silent, terrified to speak, fearing retaliation from Morales' still active enforcers. Because even with Morales behind bars, the machine still moved. Fragmented pieces of his network clawed for power. Mid-level operatives turned on one another, igniting a brutal war to claim the Empire's remains. The bloodiest battle erupted in the port city of Veracruz, one of Morales' key trafficking hubs. There, rival cartels once loyal to Morales descended, like vultures, battling for control of the smuggling routes he left behind. The result, chaos. Streets turned toward corrupt officials once paid to look the other way were among the dead. Meanwhile, law enforcement faced an unprecedented task. Arresting Morales had been one thing. Dismantling the ghost network he built was something else entirely. It required global coordination. The DE, the FBI, Interpol, local task forces across 3 continents. Everyone had to work together, sharing intelligence, tracking financial trails, launching raids on properties once considered untouchable. But Morales refused to speak. Locked away in a maximum security prison, he offered nothing. His lawyers, some of the highest paid in the world, attempted to bargain, but the mountain of evidence against him left no room for negotiation. So investigators turned to those who had once served him. One man in particular, codename Rafael, a former lieutenant in Morales' inner circle. Rafael had overseen high-value transport of both drugs and human cargo across Central America. Captured during a sting in Guatemala, he traded information for protection, and what he revealed was worse than anyone imagined. According to Rafael, Morales didn't just avoid law enforcement, he owned parts of it. Border patrol officers, customs agents, politicians, judges, all on his payroll. Those who refused were either blackmailed or disappeared. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was this. Morales operated training camps deep in the jungles of Colombia and Honduras, hidden behind armed fences, where facilities were trafficked. Individuals were conditioned. They were taught how to behave, how to speak to immigration officers, how to memorize fake identities and family histories designed to pass as asylum seekers or migrant workers. Some were children, indoctrinated, molded. The human cost was incalculable. Entire towns across Mexico and Central America had lived under Morales' shadow, fearing violence if they resisted. or worse if they talked. Families were ripped apart. Children vanished without a trace. And in the United States, the aftermath was measured in overdose deaths, thousands tied to the fentanyl and heroin Morales pumped into American cities. The trial became a global event. Survivors came forward broken, brave. One woman from Honduras took the stand and recounted how she had been trafficked at 16, sold, beaten, shuffled through multiple countries. Stripped of her name, her identity. She wasn't just a witness, she was living proof of what Morales had done. And yet the full scale of his empire may never be known, because Morales built something more than a criminal network. He built a legacy of shadows, a system of suffering, a ghost empire that lived off silence, fear, and complicity. And though he now sits behind bars, the damage he left behind continues to echo. Smuggled into the United States with promises of honest work, she thought. She was headed for a better life. Instead, she found herself trapped in a brutal human trafficking ring, just one of countless victims tied to a criminal empire that had stretched across continents. Another survivor, a former cartel enforcer, described in chilling detail the punishments dealt to anyone who dared defy the syndicate's rule. As prosecutors laid out their case, it became clear Javier El Fantasma Morales would never walk free again. His crimes had spanned decades, his victims numbered in the thousands. The jury returned a guilty verdict in less than 2 hours. Morales was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring he'd die behind bars. But even as he was led away in chains, the fight was far from over. In the aftermath, law enforcement agencies around the globe scrambled to dismantle what remained of Morales' vast network. Some of his inner circle vanished without a trace. Others scrambled to rebuild the crumbling foundations of an empire that had once seemed untouchable. Morales the ghost was gone, but his shadow remained. His cartel hadn't collapsed, it had fractured. In some corners, it had even grown more dangerous. And in that chaos, one name began to surface over and over again. Esteban Rojas. Rojas had been Morales' right hand, the ghost within the ghost's empire. If Morales was the architect, the strategist, then Rojas was the executioner. He enforced loyalty through fear, controlled by violence, and decided who lived and who disappeared without a trace. Unlike his boss, Rojas didn't care about anonymity. He was visible, brutal, feared, even by his allies, while Morales moved money through shell companies and corporate fronts. Rojas left his mark in blood from the streets of Mexico to the jungles of Colombia and Venezuela. And when Morales fell, Rojas disappeared. For nearly a year, authorities hunted him. They tracked financial transactions, monitored wiretaps, and chased whispers. Some claimed he was in Spain. Others believed he was lying low in Argentina, protected by remnants of the cartel. Then came the massacre in Riohacha, Colombia. A cartel safe house had been turned into a war zone. Bodies everywhere. Some shot execution style, others tortured. A message was scrawled in blood on the wall. El fantasma puede estar muerto, pero nosotros no hemos terminado. The ghost may be dead, but we are not finished. Investigators knew immediately this was. From there, the killings spread like wildfire. Venezuela, Honduras, and Guatemala. Each crime scene carried his signature. Rojas was purging the organization, cutting out the weak, the disloyal, and the ambitious. But in doing so, he was drawing attention from every intelligence agency in the hemisphere. Then came the break. A wiretap on a suspected cartel financier in Panama picked up a name, Isla Negra, private island in the Caribbean, officially owned by a tourism company. In reality, it had been one of Morales' most secretive operations. Few even knew it existed. Now, it was believed to be Rojas' new stronghold. A multinational task force was formed within days. Elite units from the US, Mexico, and Colombia, prepared for a high-risk operation. A direct assault would be suicide. Roas had likely fortified the island and taken hostages. So instead, they launched a precision strike. Under cover of darkness, special forces teams landed silently. Helicopters circled overhead. Drones relayed every movement. As the teams swept the compound, they uncovered the remnants of a trafficking operation: documents, cash, weapons, and dozens of captives. Some were victims awaiting transit. Others were cartel defectors. Roas had imprisoned, but Roas himself was gone. In a villa overlooking the sea, they found his last known location: a war room filled with maps, surveillance photos, and coded plans. He had been preparing something massive. But once again, Roas had vanished into the wind. The raid was a victory but incomplete. Hostages were freed, a major stronghold was destroyed, and critical intelligence was secured. But the man they came for, the final piece of Morales' empire, was still out there. For 6 more months, the hunt continued. Tips came and went. Some placed him in Morocco. Others said Dubai. Some in the lawless tri-border region of South America. Each lead ended the same: a trail gone cold. But the agents refused to give up. Then, exactly 1 year after Morales' sentencing, the call came in. A body had been found in a rundown apartment in Buenos Aires. The scene was grim. Signs of a struggle. Furniture overturned. Blood on the walls. The victim had been tortured, hands bound, throat slit. But what confirmed his identity was unmistakable. A black serpent tattoo coiled around a dagger. Roas, the enforcer of 1,000 nightmares, had died the way he lived, violently and without mercy. But who killed him? A rival cartel, a vengeful former ally, an inside betrayal. No one knows for sure. The official investigation is still ongoing, and no arrests have been made. What is certain, however, is this: the empire Morales built is gone, but the ruins it left behind are still dangerous. And while 2 of its most feared leaders now lie in prison or a grave, the war they started has yet to truly end. The investigation yielded no clear answers. Some believed Esteban Roas had simply made too many enemies, that his own men had turned on him. Others suspected law enforcement had used unconventional methods to ensure he never resurfaced. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the final vestige of Javier Morales' empire had been wiped from the map. But the war was far from over. Even as Morales rotted in a maximum security cell, and Roas lay dead in a foreign apartment, the cycle continued. New names emerged. New cartels rose from the ashes. The drug trade, the human trafficking networks, the corruption that enabled them all. It was a war without end. For the agents who had spent years chasing Morales and dismantling his syndicate, there was no celebration, no final victory. Only the cold satisfaction that for a moment had made a difference, and the chilling understanding that somewhere out in the world, another ghost was already waiting to take his place. In the months following Roas' death, the underworld began to shift. It adapted, and in some regions, it grew even more dangerous. Morales and Roas had been formidable. Yes, but their empire was never built to rely on just 2 men. What they'd created was a decentralized web of operatives, financiers, smugglers, and corrupt officials, a machine designed to survive long after its architects were gone. The FBI, and Interpol had spent years attacking that machine. They seized assets, made arrests, disrupted trafficking routes. But despite these victories, the network didn't disappear, splintered. Some of Morales' former allies saw his fall as an opportunity, a chance to seize power and claim pieces of his shattered kingdom. In Mexico, violent infighting erupted between rival factions, transforming entire cities into battlegrounds. Hundreds died in a matter of weeks. Further south, in Colombia and Venezuela, ex-Morales operatives merged with other criminal syndicates, ensuring that the routes Morales had once ruled stayed operational. Drugs still moved north. Women and children were still trafficked. The corruption that once protected Morales, it remained untouched in many places. For law enforcement, his fall had been a symbolic victory, but the reality on the ground told a different story. One of the biggest ongoing challenges was the money. Morales' fortune wasn't locked in vaults, it was hidden in offshore accounts, cryptocurrency wallets, and an intricate web of shell companies across multiple continents. Despite seizing millions, much of the cartel's wealth remained untouched, and there was one man who knew exactly where to find it: Felipe Elio Vargas. Vargas had once been Morales' financial mastermind, the architect of the cartel's money laundering operations. Unlike Roas, Vargas didn't rule through fear. He wasn't seen with guns. He never attended executions. His hands were clean, his profile invisible. But make no mistake, he was just as dangerous. Vargas understood something Morales never fully mastered. Money is power. While Morales had built dominance with violence, Vargas had built influence, quietly, strategically. Behind closed doors in luxury hotels, private banks, and political backrooms, he forged relationships with corporate executives, politicians, and international financiers. He built a financial empire that stretched from the skyscrapers of Manhattan to the tax havens of the Cayman Islands. And when Morales fell, Vargas didn't flinch. He vanished. Law enforcement believed he fled to Dubai beyond the reach of extradition, protected by wealth and anonymity. But even in hiding, he continued managing the financial core of Morales' empire. The money kept flowing, but Vargas didn't just want to preserve Morales' legacy. He wanted to evolve it. He began shifting the cartel's operations away from traditional drug smuggling and toward high-level financial crime, cyber fraud, wire scams, and elite corruption. His vision was clear. Forget the streets, control the systems. Instead of fighting law enforcement, Vargas would own them. And in many ways, he already did. Through an elaborate network of shell corporations and offshore holdings, Vargas controlled billions. Real estate portfolios, shipping lines, private security firms, investment funds, to the outside world. He was just another wealthy investor man who donated to charities and attended international summits. But behind the scenes, he was building something far more dangerous than what Morales ever dreamed of. A legitimate empire, powered by cartel money. Law enforcement knew Vargas had become their top target. But he was unlike any criminal they had faced before. There were no phone calls to trace, no bodies to tie him to. He left no trail. He was deliberate, careful, always 5 steps ahead. Then came the break. The Panama Papers leak a massive trove of financial documents, expose decades of hidden transactions, shady partnerships, and secret offshore accounts. Buried deep among them, the name Felipe Vargas. For the first time, investigators had a real trail: business partnerships, money transfers, and connections tying Vargas directly to Morales' empire. But exposing Vargas would be no easy task. Unlike Morales, who ruled through terror, Vargas ruled through relationships. He had powerful allies in governments, banks, and multinational corporations, and he was willing to fight. In Washington, a joint task force was formed: cybercrime experts, financial investigators, and intelligence operatives. Their mission: follow the money, expose Vargas, bring him down. But Vargas had already anticipated their moves. Before the task force could act, key witnesses vanished. Bank accounts were emptied. Digital records were wiped clean. It was as if someone inside had warned him. And that's when the agents realized the full scale of Vargas's reach. He didn't just control money. He controlled people, judges, law enforcement, even elected officials. His influence was so vast, it could erase investigations before they began. Then came the killings. One by one, individuals linked to the case began dying under mysterious circumstances. A forensic accountant in Miami found dead in his apartment. A financial analyst in London stabbed in a hotel elevator. A whistleblower in the Cayman's boat exploded off the coast. The message was clear. Vargas wasn't running. He was retaliating. And yet the task force kept going, quietly, carefully, waiting for one mistake. Because they knew that beneath the image of wealth and prestige, Felipe Vargas was still running the remnants of a criminal empire built on blood. And if they didn't stop him, no one would. A so-called robbery. That's how it started. A journalist, in Mexico City, working on a story about Vargas, was gunned down in broad daylight. The message couldn't have been clearer. Vargas was untouchable, but law enforcement didn't flinch. They changed tactics. Traditional methods were abandoned in favor of deep cover operations, cyber infiltration, and embedded informants inside Vargas's own network. Dangerous work, high stakes, but it was the only way. As investigators closed in, Vargas made one last, desperate play, attempting to buy his way into legitimacy. Using his immense wealth, he tried securing political asylum in a country with no extradition treaty, and for a time it looked like he might pull it off. Then came the betrayal. A former cartel lawyer, once one of Vargas's most trusted associates, turned informant. He handed over the final piece of evidence, direct proof, tying Vargas to human trafficking and massive drug operations. It was enough. In a coordinated international sting, Vargas was arrested on a private jet en route to Russia. His capture sent shockwaves through the underworld. The king had fallen, but the war was far from over. Vargas had learned from Morales, where Morales ruled through brute violence. Vargas built a decentralized empire. His arrest didn't dismantle the machine, it merely removed the face. Behind the scenes, the power vacuum triggered a chain reaction. Money still flowed, deals still happened, and those once protected by Vargas's new time was running out. Hesitate, and they'd be next. Then came the Black Ledger, a secret financial record containing the names of Vargas, high-profile clients, corrupt politicians, judges, corporate executives. It was his insurance policy, his last safeguard against betrayal. But now, it was missing. Some believed it had been seized by law enforcement and buried deep within classified archives. Others whispered that it was never found, that Vargas had hidden it before his arrest. Some even claimed someone else had it now, someone waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Whoever held the ledger held power. Then, weeks after Vargas' arrest, U.S. federal prosecutor Daniel vanished. He had been the one leading the charge, pushing for Vargas' trial to move forward. Years of work, an airtight case. Then, he was gone. His car was found on a quiet stretch of road, outside Washington, D.C., engine running. Phone on the passenger seat. No signs of struggle. No calls. No warnings. One day, he was building a case. The next, he was erased. The FBI launched a full investigation. Every lead dead-ended. Security footage tampered. Witnesses saw nothing. Family received no threats. No ransom. Just silence. And just like that, the case began to fall apart. Without Henshaw, evidence could disappear. Witnesses might recant, and the ledger, if it even existed, might never surface. The message was unmistakable. If they could reach Henshaw, they could reach anyone. As authorities scrambled, a new name emerged from the shadows. The Ghost Syndicate, nameless, faceless, operating outside any known cartel structure. They didn't spill blood in the streets. They didn't leave trails. They operated in silence, through whispers, through fear, through control. Unlike Vargas, who still relied on tradition, the Ghost Syndicate was something new, something worse. Some believed it was made up of Vargas' surviving loyalists. Others thought it was a separate force, one that had existed in the background all along, waiting. Every time law enforcement got close to uncovering a lead, it vanished. Documents were wiped, bank accounts deleted, informants died quietly. Then came the warning, an untraceable message to one of the lead FBI agents. Stop looking, or you'll end up like Hen. The game had changed, but while law enforcement faltered, one person refused to let it die. Investigative journalist Alina Vasquez. She had followed Vargas for years, seen empires rise and fall. But this was different. She didn't believe Hen had just disappeared. She believed he was taken, and she believed the Black Ledger was the key. If she could find it, she could expose everything. Her search led her from the streets of Mexico City to Miami's corporate towers, where shell companies were used to launder cartel money. She spoke to former insiders, disgraced ex-cops, hackers. What she uncovered was more terrifying than she imagined. The ledger was real, and someone far more dangerous than Vargas now had it. Her sources whispered one name, Spectre. No one knew who or what Spectre was. But if Vargas had been untouchable, Spectre was unstoppable, and Alina was getting too close. Anonymous threats flooded her inbox. Surveillance outside her apartment clicked. Someone broke into her home, didn't steal anything except one USB drive, her notes, her files. Then came the message, stop digging, you don't know what you're dealing with. She had a choice, walk away or risk everything. She chose the latter. Her final lead pointed her to Dubai. As she boarded her flight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She was right. A man sat 2 rows behind her, expressionless, pretending to read a newspaper. He made a call, no words, just silence, then hung up. Somewhere, in a hidden room, behind encrypted firewalls and silent operations, Spectre was watching. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. She wasn't just being followed. She was being hunted, somewhere across the globe. A place unreachable by most. A man known only as Spectre sat in a shadow-drenched room, eyes fixed on a wall of encrypted monitors. Security feeds, financial ledgers, and global news ticked by in real time. Among the headlines, the arrest of Miguel Vargas. But Vargas was never the prize. He was a distraction, necessary collateral. The real engine behind Spectre's decades empire remained untouched. The Black Ledger. It wasn't just a document. It was the backbone of a hidden empire, holding the names of CEOs, politicians, high-ranking military officials, and cartel leaders, figures who had all traded their souls for influence. It was Spectre's greatest weapon, and Alina Vasquez was getting too close. Asterisk. Spectre had seen her kind before. Idealistic journalists, convinced they could change the world with the truth. But Alina didn't yet understand that the world didn't revolve around justice. It ran on control. And control was something Spectre had in abundance. Alina's flight touched down in Dubai beneath the cover of night. The shimmering skyline painted the desert in gold, a city of opulence and shadow. Beneath its polished surface, power operated in whispers, and money bought silence. Moving swiftly through customs, she kept her head down. The man from the plane was still trailing her, always, just far enough behind to not raise suspicion. She checked into a modest hotel, made contact with her informant, a former financial analyst for a bank long suspected of laundering cartel money. He'd promised her access to the hidden location of the Black Ledger. They were supposed to meet at a small cafe on the city's outskirts. But when she arrived, she found him slumped in his chair, a thin red line across his throat. The message was clear. She was already too late. Panic surged through her. For years, Alina believed knowledge was power, that truth always triumphed. But now, staring at the lifeless man who might have led her to the truth, she realized something far more terrifying. They were always 10 steps ahead. She turned to leave. But the moment she stepped outside, a black SUV screeched to a halt. 2 men in suits stepped out. No badges, no words, just cold, practiced efficiency. The kind that came from years of making people vanish. Alina ran through back alleys and crowded markets. Her heart pounded as adrenaline coursed through her veins. She knew what would happen if they caught her. She wouldn't be arrested. She wouldn't even be questioned. she would be erased. In a narrow alley behind the marketplace, someone grabbed her arm. She twisted, ready to fight only to find a stranger staring back. Not one of them. Someone else. Without a word, he pulled her into a waiting car. It sped off before she could speak. Gasping, Alina tried to gather her thoughts. We don't have much time, the man said, his voice calm but urgent. She studied him, mid-40s, sharp features, and a presence that didn't belong to law enforcement or journalism. Then she saw it. A tattoo on his wrist. A symbol she'd only seen once before, buried in Vargas's classified files. Her voice dropped. You work for them. I used to, he replied. Elena's instincts screamed this was a trap, but then, unexpectedly, the man handed her a flash drive. This is what you're looking for, he said. Everything, the names, the accounts, the black ledger. She stared at it. Why? His eyes softened. Because I made a mistake. I thought we were just running a business. I didn't see what it really was, or what he really was. Alina clutched the drive as if it were her last breath. Then, help me stop this, she said. He hesitated, then nodded. For the first time in his life, he betrayed the empire that raised him. Back in the shadows of his surveillance bunker, Spectre watched the monitors in silence. He had known this moment would come, the fall of Vargas, the exposure of the Black Ledger, but he didn't fear scandal. Scandals didn't destroy empires. Power did, and Spectre still held the strings. He made a single call. No threats, no names, just a quiet command. It's time for the next move. And in the dark places of the world, the pieces began to shift. Once again, Case Te Charifa. Humid summer air clung to the rugged northern coastline of Australia. The vast Pacific met desolate beaches and cliffs. Law enforcement struggled to monitor every inch. And in those shadows, a man named Daniel, Danny O'Keefe, thrived. Danny wasn't a reckless criminal. He was a ghost, a strategist with no face, no signature, and no trail. Born in Sydney in the early 1970s, Danny had once shown promise. Intelligent, articulate, with a bright future in finance or international business. His father was a respected lawyer, his mother, a school principal. His siblings all followed safe, successful paths, but not Danny. From a young age, he could read people, manipulate them. By his early 20s, he had left the world of academics behind and immersed himself in Australia's underworld. He started small, fraud, counterfeit goods, off the books, imports. Then he went global. Drug trafficking, human smuggling. But Danny wasn't flashy, no penthouses, no Lamborghinis, just a modest Melbourne home and a near-invisible profile. He had built one of the most complex smuggling operations in the Southern Hemisphere, and hardly anyone knew his name. In 2015, he launched a plan that would define his legacy. It was bold, it was precise, and if it worked, it would be the largest trafficking scheme in Australian history. The plan: hide drugs and people inside legitimate commercial shipments. The method: use global cargo routes, corrupt customs officials, and fake manifests to move methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine and people through Australia, from Asia and South America. He forged alliances with powerful cartels, gained access to vulnerable migrant populations, and used their desperation to fuel his network. To them, Australia was hope. To Danny, they were inventory, industrial machinery, medical supplies, even agricultural shipments, concealed both narcotics and human cargo. Containers became coffins, but profits soared. Still, empires built in silence always attract attention. By 2016, a coalition of Australian border force, federal police, and international intelligence had started watching. They'd taken down traffickers before, but Danny, he never touched a shipment, never made a call. He didn't even exist, not on paper, and yet, he was everywhere. He was a ghost in the criminal underworld, never too close to the deals, never leaving a trail. But in early 2017, everything changed. A seemingly routine cargo inspection at the port of Darwin triggered a seismic shift in Australia's fight against organized crime. Inside, a container marked as industrial machinery from Malaysia, officers uncovered something chilling. Hidden behind steel walls was a makeshift, air-conditioned compartment. Inside were 26 people, men, women, and children, weak from hunger and dehydration. Alongside them, tightly packed and vacuum-sealed bricks, lay hundreds of kilos of high-purity methamphetamine, street value over $200 million. This wasn't just another smuggling job, it was a revelation. The scale, the precision, the brutality, this was the work of a criminal mastermind. And all roads led to one name, Danny O'Keefe. But Danny, ever the strategist, had planned for this. His empire was built on layers of shell companies, offshore, accounts, loyal lieutenants, and fear. He insulated himself from every operation. Even as authorities traced the Darwin container back to him, he carried on as if nothing had happened. But the raid had ignited something bigger. International agencies joined forces. Undercover operatives moved in. More containers were intercepted in Sydney, Perth, and Brisbane, each carrying the same deadly cargo, people and narcotics. The empire Danny had built over decades was starting to crack. By mid-2017, authorities had enough to move. They raided his Melbourne home. It was empty. No Danny, no records. Only burner phones and fragments of financial activity. He had vanished. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in Australian history. From the chaos of Bangkok to the quiet villas of the Pacific, his network was picked apart. Associates were arrested, assets seized, and still no trace. Until a tiny banking transaction changed everything. In early 2018, a wire transfer in Argentina linked to a shell company triggered an alert. Investigators followed the money to a discreet, upscale villa in Uruguay. That's where they found him. The arrest of Danny O'Keefe wasn't just the fall of a man, it was the collapse of an empire. His extradition sparked a media storm. His trial was one of the most publicized in Australian history. Prosecutors laid bare the horrors. Billions laundered, thousands of people trafficked, an international criminal syndicate that had thrived for years in the shadows. The court sentenced him to life in prison. But even behind bars, the legend of Danny O'Keefe didn't die. He never spoke in court, never showed remorse. He listened in silence as they described his empire in brutal detail. The judge called him a methodical and ruthless criminal, a mastermind of modern crime. But Danny never saw himself as evil. In his eyes, he had simply played the same game the world plays, only better. Governments turned a blind eye to suffering if it wasn't profitable. Corporations built fortunes on the backs of the desperate. Danny had done the same. He gave the world what it wanted, drugs for the addicted, escape for the hopeless, and wealth for the bold. If anything, he believed he had simply exposed the world's hypocrisy. But for all his planning, he made one fatal mistake. Trust. His empire ran on fear and loyalty, and for a time, it worked. But as pressure mounted and arrests piled up, his trusted inner circle began to crumble. Facing life sentences, they flipped. Secrets spilled, deals were cut, and the man who built his legacy on silence found himself betrayed by the very people who once swore to protect it. Still, Danny had prepared for this. Some assets remained hidden, accounts untouched, safe houses unlinked to any known alias, and scattered across the globe, loyalists who had never been exposed. The operation hadn't died. It had simply gone dark. Inside the cold concrete walls of Darwin prison, Danny sat, quietly. To the guards, he was a broken man. But they didn't know Danny. He wasn't broken. He was waiting. He understood something most didn't. That true power didn't come from violence or fear, but from understanding people, their desperation, their weakness. their hunger for something more, and while his enemies celebrated, the whispers outside told a different story. In the neon-lit bars of Sydney's underworld, his name still carried weight. Rival factions clawed at the scraps of his fallen empire, but among the chaos were those who remained loyal. Smugglers, hackers, financiers, enforcers. Not everyone had walked away. Danny hadn't built an empire alone, and those who had stood by him before were still out there waiting for the signal. The authorities thought they had dismantled his network, but for every known alias, there were a dozen unknown. For every seized account, another sat untouched, and for every man behind bars, another remained free. Danny knew it, and he knew the world had made one mistake, underestimating him. In the end, the question wasn't if Danny O'Keefe would rise again. It was when, Case 4, the Shadow Empire. The signal traveled silently across the Pacific, landing in a sleek high-rise apartment in Hong Kong. There, a man named Jen Wei sat before a wall of monitors, his fingers dancing across a keyboard. To the world, Jen was just another quiet investment banker, but in truth, he was one of the most sophisticated money launderers Danny O'Keefe had ever known. For years, Jen had discreetly funneled billions through layers of shell companies, crypto transactions, and shadowy financial instruments. Now, with Danny behind bars, he began the process of unfreezing hidden accounts so buried not even Danny's closest associates in Argentina had known they existed. Meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, a mysterious woman known only as Valeria contacted a retired pilot, an old ally of Danny's, who owed him his life. The man had once flown countless covert routes, smuggling everything from contraband to people across borders. With one call, he was back in the game. In Thailand, another trusted contact secured forged documents, passports, IDs, travel, visas, one crafted to be undetectable by even the most advanced biometric systems. Quietly, piece by piece, Danny's escape was being orchestrated. Inside Baran prison, Danny O'Keefe waited. Unlike impulsive inmates who tried to force their way out, Danny had approached his escape with the same meticulous calculation he had used to build his empire. It started with the guards. Every prison had pressure points, and those points were always human. Over time, Danny had identified 3 guards. One was drowning in gambling debt. Another had a daughter in need of costly medical treatment. The third simply hated his job and the system he worked for. Through encrypted messages smuggled via the prison's underground network, Danny made them offers they couldn't refuse. The first agreed to look the other way in exchange for enough cash to erase his debts. The second agreed to shut down security cameras for exactly 3 minutes. And the third, disillusioned and bitter, would quietly unlock Danny's cell and disappear into the chaos. Outside the walls, another part of the plan was in motion. A team of mercenaries paid an untraceable crypto set off an explosion at a power substation 3 miles from the prison. The resulting blackout was timed to the second dot. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the lights flickered and then died. In the confusion, the compromised guard opened Danny's cell. Within 60 seconds, Danny was moving through the prison's corridors, bypassing disabled security systems, following a pre-mapped path to a service tunnel. By the time backup generators kicked in, he was already gone. When authorities reconstructed the events, Danny O'Keefe had vanished without a trace. The escape gripped headlines around the world. Airports were locked down, ports monitored, borders flooded with alerts. But it was too late by then. Danny was already thousands of miles away aboard a private jet piloted by the same smuggler who'd once ferried his secrets through the sky. His destination, unknown. His empire, quiet, but far from dead. As Danny looked out at the endless horizon, he knew one thing. He wasn't finished. Case 5. The kingpin beneath the coasting. The early 2010s. Australia faced a silent crisis, one not broadcast in headlines, but hidden in shipping. Containers, remote airstrips, and the depths of bureaucratic systems. The country's vast, under-patrolled coastline had become a gateway for a global criminal network dealing in two currencies, drugs and human lives. At the center of this empire was Benjamin Ben Thomas's name that would soon be spoken with. Fear and disgust across the nation in his mid-40s. Ben was a tall, stern-faced figure with short-cropped dark hair and cold eyes that betrayed nothing of the horrors he orchestrated. Born in Sydney to a broken home, he was raised by a struggling single mother and fell into petty crime as a teenager. But unlike other delinquents, Ben possessed a chilling intelligence and a ruthless hunger for power. By his late 20s, Ben had climbed through the ranks of the Australian underworld. His turning point came when he forged alliances with international syndicates from Southeast Asia to Europe. These connections would birth a global pipeline, one that smuggled massive quantities of drugs and trafficked countless human lives. Ben's rise was swift and calculated. He bribed officials, exploited weak systems, and built a network that infiltrated every level of society. His drug empire included cocaine, ecstasy, synthetic opioids, and methamphetamines, all smuggled with surgical precision, hidden in heavy machinery, sealed within legitimate exports, or disguised as routine cargo. The shipments moved through Sydney's docks with disturbing ease, but it wasn't just drugs. Ben's human trafficking operation was even more sinister. Using his ties in Southeast Asia, he lured vulnerable women and children into Australia under the guise of jobs, education, or new beginnings. Instead, they were forced into exploitation, trapped in a life they never chose. He used every method imaginable to mask the operation. Front companies, fake visas, even diplomatic channels. And while violence was part of his toolkit, Ben's real power came from leverage. He controlled people not just through fear, but through carefully crafted compromise threats, blackmail, and financial ruin. For years, he was untouchable, but in 2013, the first crack appeared. A routine drug bust in Melbourne uncovered a cache of synthetic opioids. What began as a minor seizure escalated when investigators found traces linking the shipment to a shipping company with deep ties to Ben's enterprise. The Australian Federal Police (AFP) began digging, and what they uncovered shocked even the most seasoned officers. This was no ordinary syndicate. It was a sprawling, multinational machine. It took more than a year of surveillance, undercover operations, and slow, deliberate infiltration to begin understanding its scale. Undercover agents earned the trust of Ben's lower-tier operatives. Through them, the AFP began mapping the true extent of the operation, and it was only the beginning. They never meant to become heroes, but the information they unknowingly provided would become the key to unraveling an empire. Authorities had long suspected that Ben Thomas was more than just a drug lord, but they had no idea just how deep his criminal network went or how many lives were at stake until a single, intercepted shipment in early 2015 changed everything. The container was supposed to hold meth. Instead, it held something far worse: dozens of women and children, crammed into a steel box with no ventilation, food, or water. Some were unconscious, others were already dead. What they found was a horror that came too late for some, but just in time for the truth. This was the smoking gun. For years, law enforcement had suspected a link between drug trafficking and human trafficking, but now they had undeniable proof. These weren't just shipments of narcotics. These were shipments of human lives. The discovery shocked Australia and sparked an unprecedented response from the Australian Federal Police, AFP. A full-scale investigation was launched, forensic teams combing through every inch of the cargo container for clues. What they found painted a chilling picture. The women and children had been trafficked from poor Southeast Asian villages, lured by false promises of jobs and education. Instead, they were treated like cargo, disposable, voiceless, and nearly invisible. But they weren't alone. As the investigation expanded, the AFP uncovered a vast network of safe houses hidden in plain sight in the back rooms of massage parlors, nail salons, and restaurants across Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. Inside, victims were kept in horrific conditions, subjected to forced labor, sexual exploitation, and systematic abuse. Some were held for months, others for years. And at the center of it all was Ben Thomas. Using his immense wealth and influence, Ben had built a criminal empire unlike any Australia had ever seen. His operation wasn't just large, it was sophisticated, protected by layers of corruption. Politicians, law enforcement officers, and respected business owners had all played their part either by accepting bribes or turning a blind eye. For years, Ben's empire had thrived in the shadows, immune to consequences. Until now, realizing the scale of the operation, the AFP brought in global partners including Interpol and the FBI. Intelligence began flowing in from all corners of the world. For the first time in years, the puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place. But Ben, he wasn't panicking, he was watching. Alerted to the investigation, Ben took steps to protect himself, moving between safe houses, changing identities, and using a network of informants to stay one step ahead of the law. He was careful, calculated, untouchable, until early 2016. That's when an undercover agent infiltrated one of Ben's drug shipments, posing as a low-level street dealer. The agent soon earned the trust of Samir Malik, a violent enforcer and key figure in Ben's organization. Through Samir, the AFP gained crucial intelligence, addresses, names, and locations of major stash houses and safe havens. Raids began immediately. The first took place in Melbourne, at a warehouse tied to one of Ben's front companies. Inside, officers discovered a massive cache of narcotics, cocaine, meth, ecstasy, and synthetic opioids hidden beneath legitimate goods. But it was what lay beyond the warehouse that stunned investigators. In a small, unmarked building nearby, they found several trafficked women, malnourished, terrified, and barely clinging to life. They were rushed to safety, finally freed from the nightmare they'd endured for so long. One by one, more victims were rescued. Some had been trafficked recently. Others had been trapped for years. They bore the marks of trauma, physical and emotional, but their stories helped build the case against Ben. With every raid, the evidence grew. Still, Ben remained elusive. That changed in late 2016, when an informant from within his inner circle provided Ben's exact location. He had been hiding in plain sight, using a web of false identities and backdoor properties to stay off the radar. But the net had finally closed in. On the night of December 4th, 2016, the AFP launched one final operation. It was swift and decisive. Ben Thomas was captured in a remote area of New South Wales. There was a brief standoff, but no shots were fired. After years of evasion, Australia's most elusive crime lord was finally in custody. He was charged with an avalanche of crimes: large-scale drug trafficking, human trafficking, corruption, and leadership of a transnational organized crime syndicate. The arrest marked a significant victory, but it was a sobering one. The investigation had peeled back the layers of a deeply entrenched underworld. It wasn't just a drug ring. It was a mirror held up to society, revealing just how far greed, silence, and complicity could stretch. Thousands of lives had been devastated by Ben's empire. Many victims would never fully recover, but there was justice now. And with every trial, every arrest, and every voice finally heard, the system that protected Ben was crumbling. In 2017, Ben Thomas went on trial. It became one of the most publicized court cases in Australian history. Survivors filled the courtroom, some testifying for the first time, others simply watching, their silent presence speaking louder than words. The prosecution laid out a brutal account of manipulation, abuse, and industrial-scale exploitation. Ben's defense claimed he was nothing more than a businessman who got in too deep, but the evidence was overwhelming. After a lengthy trial, Ben Thomas was found guilty on all major counts. The verdict sent shockwaves through Australia, not just because justice had been served, but because it revealed how fragile that justice had been all along. In the months that followed, dozens more arrests were made, laws were rewritten, safeguards were put in place. But for the victims, the scars remained. No sentence, no headline, and no court ruling could erase the years stolen from them. Ben had tried to build an empire on silence, but now, the world was listening. Ben Thomas was ultimately convicted on all charges after several grueling months. In court, his sentence, life in prison, was hailed as a hard-earned victory for the countless victims who had suffered under his rule. Yet, for many, the verdict was bittersweet. No punishment could ever undo the trauma or reclaim the years lost in the shadows of his criminal empire. But the story didn't end with Ben's conviction. While his network had been fractured, the damage he inflicted on Australia, both its people and its institutions, was enduring. His case became a catalyst for change, prompting national outrage, legislative action, and a renewed focus on dismantling human trafficking operations. Advocates and lawmakers rallied, using Ben's downfall as a symbol that even the most well-protected and deeply entrenched criminals could be brought to justice. Ben now sits behind bars in a maximum security prison, forgotten by many but not by the victims whose lives he shattered. Though his personal reign of terror is over, the aftershocks of his empire still ripple through the nation. The impact of his criminal enterprise stretched far beyond the immediate collapse of his drug and human trafficking operations. For years, Australia had fought to maintain a fragile balance, combating organized crime, safeguarding the vulnerable, and meeting international demands to tackle the global trafficking trade. Ben Thomas disrupted that balance completely. He turned Australia into a strategic hub in a vast global network, one that spanned continents and exploited systems that were supposed to protect the innocent. The full scale of his operations, once revealed, stunned both law enforcement and the criminal world. Investigators discovered just how deeply embedded Ben's empire had become, hidden behind layers of legal businesses, bolstered by powerful allies and shielded by corruption. In the wake of his arrest, authorities scrambled to piece together the labyrinth he had built. His organization was not only well-financed and highly structured, it was deeply enmeshed within legitimate sectors of society. From massage parlors to high-end nightclubs, seemingly innocent establishments were exposed as fronts for drug distribution and human trafficking. Many of these operations spanned Australia's largest cities, and dismantling them wasn't easy. Resistance was fierce. Some business owners, previously under Ben's protection, attempted to distance themselves or deny involvement, but investigations revealed that Ben had forged relationships with a wide network of criminals, businessmen, and even officials, people who had helped him operate for years without scrutiny. At the same time, the Australian government was forced to confront difficult truths about its own systems. While trafficking is a global crisis, Australia's role as a destination for victims exposed serious gaps in its laws, immigration protocols, and victim protection services. Survivor testimonies painted a harrowing picture. Many victims were lured with promises of opportunity, legitimate jobs, visas, and new beginnings. But upon arrival, their documents were confiscated, and they were forced into exploitation. Others were smuggled in with fake identities, their presence concealed by forged paperwork and shell operations. Once inside the country, they had no way out. Their voices were critical to the investigation. Survivors not only helped law enforcement unravel how the trafficking ring functioned, but they also inspired a wave of public empathy and national solidarity. In response, the government partnered with NGOs and survivor-led organizations to create specialized rehabilitation programs. These initiatives offered housing, psychological support, education, and vocational training, but healing wasn't easy. The trauma endured by survivors ran deep, and recovery was a slow, uneven road. Still, many began to speak out, raising awareness and fueling public demand for reform. As a result, sweeping changes followed. Laws were strengthened, penalties for traffickers increased, victim identification protocols were improved, and, most importantly, survivors were given a greater voice in shaping the systems that had failed them. But while Ben's arrest marked a pivotal moment, the battle was far from over. The infrastructure he created remained, and many of his criminal associates had simply gone underground. The Australian Federal Police, AFP, in cooperation with Interpol and the FBI, expanded their focus to tracking down the remnants of Ben's syndicate, now scattered, but still dangerous. Investigations revealed that Ben's influence extended far beyond Australian borders. He had forged connections across South America, Eastern Europe, and Asia. Synthetic opioids and trafficking victims were funneled through his routes using sophisticated laundering and smuggling systems. Some of those channels remained operational even after his capture. Months passed, and the AFP continued their work, tearing down Ben's empire piece by piece. But a sobering reality lingered. For every trafficker caught, countless victims remained. The global trade in drugs and human lives was not easily extinguished. It would take more than arrests. It would take sustained international effort, deeper awareness, and continued vigilance. Even now, locked away in prison, Ben Thomas casts a long shadow. His empire exposed the painful truth that human trafficking is not just a criminal issue, it's systemic, deeply woven into the fabric of societies and economies. His case forced Australia to confront its vulnerabilities and reminded the world that beneath the surface of modern life, horrors still exist in plain sight. Ben Thomas had never been acting alone. He was just one cog in a sprawling wheel machine. And once that truth came to light, authorities knew they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a lone trafficker. They were facing a global network of organized crime. That realization triggered a full-scale international response. In 2017, Australian authorities expanded their efforts beyond their borders, launching joint operations with Interpol and Southeast Asian law enforcement agencies. The goal to dismantle the trafficking routes used to funnel people into Australia. Ben Thomas had helped establish and expand. These operations were high-risk, time-consuming, and deeply complex. But they were necessary, because what was uncovered wasn't just a criminal syndicate, it was an ecosystem, a web of corruption and exploitation that had taken root across continents. By the time Ben's trial began in late 2017, it was clear that his arrest was only the beginning. His was the first thread pulled in a much larger unraveling. The full scope of his operation, spanning drug smuggling, human trafficking, money laundering, and systemic corruption, would take years to fully uncover. What became evident through survivor testimonies, data forensics, and multinational intelligence sharing was staggering. Ben Thomas had helped build one of the most efficient, brutal, and far-reaching trafficking syndicates Australia had ever encountered. But amid the darkness, something else began to rise. Hope. Survivors, voiceless, trapped, and stripped of their humanity, began to speak out. Empowered by safety, therapy, and each other, they became symbols of resistance. Their courage to relive trauma in courtrooms, interviews, and debriefings helped drive legislative change and shine a global spotlight on trafficking that had long been hidden in the shadows. Their strength became a call to action, and what investigators found only deepened the national reckoning. Encrypted communications recovered from Ben's devices revealed an international syndicate, one that stretched across Southeast Asia and into the very heart of Australia's institutions. This wasn't just a case of smuggling. It was a multinational enterprise, functioning with terrifying precision. Ben's connections extended to powerful gangs in Thailand and the Philippines. These groups, some of whom controlled entire neighborhoods and cities, supplied victims and drugs alike. And in return, Ben's organization offered safe passage, forged identities, and airtight logistics. It was a global operation built on desperation and enforced by fear. For every promise of a better life, there was a victim trapped in forced labor, sex trafficking, or debt bondage. Thousands were smuggled into Australia, only to find themselves abused, exploited, and discarded. But as law enforcement tried to shut it all down, another, more disturbing truth surfaced. The system itself had helped him. Corruption had seeped into border control, immigration, even the judiciary. Bribes had changed hands. Officials had waved shipments through, processed false identities, or simply turned a blind eye. Some had even actively protected the syndicate. Australia's pride in its strict immigration controls and national security was suddenly in question, because what Ben Thomas had revealed wasn't just a criminal underworld, it was a mirror, and in it, the country saw its flaws exposed. Public outrage was swift and loud. The demand for reform was unavoidable. Investigations were launched, not only into traffickers, but into the institutions that had enabled them. But in the eye of the storm were the survivors, the real victims, people who had been promised jobs, safety, and hope only to be abused, isolated, and broken. Take Maria. She had arrived in Australia, believing she'd work at a beauty salon in Melbourne. She was shown photos of women laughing in sunlight, earning money, building new lives. But within days, her passport was taken. She was forced into a brothel. Her life became a cycle of violence, fear, and silence. She didn't dare speak out until one night, an undercover officer posed as a client. That was her escape. Her story, like so many others, was not unique. Some survivors had been trafficked for years. Others had only been in the country a few months, but all shared one thing: the scars, physical, emotional, and invisible. Many blamed themselves. Many had been brainwashed into silence. Many still feared their traffickers, who often threatened their families back home, but they spoke anyway. Their testimonies helped police map out the full extent of Ben's operations. Their courage gave other survivors hope, and their resilience reminded the world that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about change. Through 2018 and beyond, the Australian Federal Police, Interpol, and numerous NGOs worked to trace and dismantle the remnants of Ben's empire. Some of his accomplices were caught and convicted. Others vanished, protected by new identities and old loyalties in countries with fewer extradition laws. The trial itself dragged on for years, bogged down by the complexity of charges: human trafficking, drug distribution, money laundering, organized crime, and more. The prosecution pushed for the maximum penalty, arguing that Ben Thomas had destroyed lives, exploited vulnerabilities, and corrupted systems. His actions, they said, represented not just criminal greed, but a direct attack on human dignity. His defense team, predictably, tried to paint him as a scapegoat, a victim of circumstance, a businessman who got in too deep. But the evidence spoke louder, and so did the survivors. Ben Thomas would ultimately be convicted, but his story was far from over, because the real cost of his empire wasn't counted in money or territory. It was counted in lives, and for those who suffered, the journey toward healing had only just begun. Ben Thomas was once thought to be just a cog in a much larger machine, but as evidence mounted, that illusion shattered. Ben wasn't a pawn, he was the mastermind. He had designed every aspect of his operation with chilling precision. In 2019, after a grueling legal battle, Ben Thomas was convicted on multiple counts, including human trafficking, organized crime, and drug-related offenses. His sentencing was a national reckoning. The trial peeled back the layers of a criminal empire, revealing the full scope of its devastation. And for the first time, the survivors had their voices heard. In court, they stood before the man who had orchestrated their suffering. For some, it was a moment of release, a chance to reclaim power and dignity. For others, it was re-traumatizing, a painful reminder of the horrors they had endured. But they spoke, and the world listened. Ben Thomas was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. But his punishment wasn't the story's final chapter. The true legacy of his case was the wave of reform that followed. The Australian government, in collaboration with human rights groups, rolled out sweeping changes. New policies prioritized victim support, increased legal protections, and strengthened international cooperation. But perhaps the most important shift was philosophical. Prevention became a cornerstone, because stopping trafficking wasn't just about locking people up. It was about dismantling the conditions that allowed it to thrive in the first place. Ben Thomas's story was tragic, an illustration of how unchecked greed and systemic corruption can rot a nation from within. But it was also a story of resilience, of survivors who fought their way out of darkness, of law enforcement officers who risked their lives to bring truth to light, of communities determined to heal. Australia would never be the same. The shockwaves of Ben's downfall forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths, and in the rubble of his empire, something new began to grow: awareness, reform, and resolve. As Ben sat in a maximum security prison, his empire in ruins, the world outside kept changing. The damage he caused could never be undone, but the lessons he left behind began shaping the future in the years following his conviction. Australia and its international partners began a deep period of reflection. The collapse of one of the largest trafficking syndicates in the region had exposed deep flaws not only in border protection and law enforcement, but in the very systems meant to protect the vulnerable. The survivors were not forgotten. Their bravery became the foundation of a growing global movement. Their testimonies inspired changes across borders, sparking unprecedented cooperation between governments, NGOs, and anti-trafficking coalitions. Together, they launched new initiatives aimed at stopping trafficking before it could begin, by improving data sharing, auditing immigration loopholes, and training frontline officers to recognize signs of exploitation. Yet, despite these advances, one thing became clear: the fight wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about tearing down the vast, invisible systems of exploitation woven into global trade, migration routes, and economic inequality. Meanwhile, Ben's presence still lingered. Though locked away, his reach hadn't fully faded. He had built a network designed to outlive him, one that adapted, evolved, and resisted. Through encrypted communications, his loyalists kept operations alive, trafficking drugs, people, and a new currency of power: information. Even behind bars, Ben remained dangerous. Encrypted phones, hidden messages, a shadow economy operating in silence. Law enforcement struggled to keep up, because now the battlefield had shifted from back alleys to digital spaces, where crime thrived out of sight. Still, the spotlight on Ben's case sparked broader change. His arrest and the horrifying details that came with it galvanized public outrage and international attention. Governments realized that targeting individual kingpins wasn't enough. The solution required a deeper, systemic purge. In 2021, that urgency culminated in a historic global summit held in Australia. Leaders, law enforcement agencies, NGOs, and survivors gathered to chart the future of trafficking prevention. It wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. Lessons from Ben's case were dissected, shared, and used to forge new partnerships across borders. One of the summit's most powerful moments came from a report by the International Organization for Migration. It detailed how traffickers prey on society's most vulnerable, those without family support, without resources, and without protection. Many victims came from impoverished nations, lured by false promises of safety and opportunity. Others believed they were entering legal migration channels, only to be trafficked into labor camps or brothels. From these revelations came action. A new multinational task force was formed, focused not only on prosecuting traffickers, but on preventing the conditions that made trafficking possible. This task force would operate with a clear mandate to protect the vulnerable before they could be exploited. Still, the fight is far from over. Criminal networks continue to adapt. They evolve faster than laws. They exploit loopholes in technology, finance, and global politics. But now, they're being hunted by a more informed, united front. The story of Ben Thomas is no longer just about one man's empire. It's about the world's response. It's about a global awakening, about survivors who refuse to be silenced, and about nations learning often to late that the true cost of complacency is measured in human lives. Australia may have taken down one of its most dangerous masterminds, but what matters most is what comes next, because the only way to win this war is to never let it be forgotten. Upon arrival at the global summit, the survivors who had once testified against Ben Thomas stepped into a new chapter of their journey. Many had spent years living in fear of deportation, fear of being ignored, fear of the system that had once failed them. But now, for the first time, there were organizations ready to support them, to help them rebuild what had been taken. The international community was no longer just observing. It was actively working to restore dignity and freedom to those whose lives had been shattered by Ben's vast trafficking empire. Among them was Maria, one of the first survivors to speak out during Ben's trial. Maria had since managed to rebuild much of her life. She had become a counselor, dedicating her time to guiding others out of the same darkness she had once endured. Her journey had been anything but easy. She wrestled with PTSD, depression, and the haunting memories of her exploitation. But standing on stage at the summit, her voice was steady, filled with strength and unwavering hope. Her testimony became a call to action. She spoke of her time in the brothel, the helplessness, the shame, and the long road to healing. She reminded the world that trafficking wasn't just a hidden crime, it was a global epidemic. Every year, thousands were trafficked into countries like Australia, many suffering unimaginable abuses. Maria's voice helped shift the focus of the summit. A survivor-led approach emerged as the central theme. Australia responded by pushing through significant legislative reforms. These reforms offered legal immunity to victims for immigration violations and expanded financial support for long-term recovery. The government recognized what survivors like Maria already knew, that trauma doesn't end at rescue. It lingers, often for life. Recovery required more than a bed and a warm meal. It needed consistent support, therapy, and safety for law enforcement. The summit was a turning point. It created a global forum where investigators, analysts, and frontline workers could share intelligence, tools, and techniques. New digital platforms were developed to help authorities track trafficking networks in real time. Australia's commitment grew, transforming into a hub of innovation in anti-trafficking training. Police officers, immigration agents, and social workers from around the world came to learn how to spot the subtle but chilling signs of trafficking, the fear in a victim's eyes, the silence, the hesitance to speak, and slowly change took hold. In the years following the summit, the number of trafficking cases in Australia began to decline. Criminal networks still existed. Syndicates like Ben's don't vanish overnight, but they were being exposed. Australia's reach extended globally, contributing to coordinated crackdowns in Southeast Asia, including major operations in Thailand and the Philippines. Ben Thomas's legacy, though forged in violence and exploitation, unintentionally became a catalyst for sweeping change. His name, once synonymous with the darkest corners of international crime, became a symbol of what the world refused to tolerate, and his downfall marked not just the end of an empire, but the beginning of a movement. Australia, once a victim of his crimes, became a leader in the fight against them. The nation confronted its failures head-on and emerged with renewed purpose. it had built something stronger, a framework for recovery, prevention, and justice. And Maria, she became one of the most influential voices in this global movement. Her speeches at conferences and her presence at advocacy events turned her from a victim into a force for change. She founded an organization dedicated to helping survivors reintegrate, offering counseling, legal assistance, job training, and housing. Her foundation focused not just on punishing traffickers, but on empowering those who had been hurt by them. Maria understood that healing required more than justice, it required community. Her work sparked a national shift. The Australian government re-evaluated its own systems, immigration, border control, and the economic vulnerabilities that had been exploited. The Anti-Trafficking Task Force became a permanent, well-funded agency. Officers received advanced training, and social workers were better prepared to intervene. Even the once overlooked National Trafficking Hotline was revitalized, made easier to access, and equipped to act quickly. The ripple effects of Ben Thomas's empire had once spread pain across continents, but now those same ripples carried something else: hope. The world was finally listening, and it was no longer just one country's fight. It was a shared mission, a global stand against the darkness of human trafficking. Reports of suspicious activity became easier to file, thanks to an improved national human trafficking hotline that had once been woefully underfunded. As awareness grew, a specialized international task force began working in close coordination with Australian law enforcement to target trafficking networks that crossed borders. This joint effort, named Operation Crossfire, was one of the most ambitious undertakings of its kind. It aimed not only to dismantle human trafficking rings, but also to disrupt the narcotics trade that profited from human exploitation. The central goal of Operation Crossfire was clear: sever the deeply rooted ties between drug cartels and human trafficking syndicates, connections that had been a hallmark of Ben Thomas' criminal empire. Investigations revealed a disturbing evolution. Trafficking organizations were no longer just smuggling drugs. They had pivoted to trafficking people on a massive scale, repurposing the same smuggling routes and distribution networks. The link between these two industries was undeniable, and Ben's former associates, once feared figures in the underworld, had now become high-priority targets. In a growing web of international intelligence operations, as law enforcement closed in on these, criminals arresting mid-level enforcers and shutting down brothels and warehouses, a broader threat began to take shape. The structures that once upheld Ben's empire, corruption, greed, and systemic exploitation, had not vanished. They had simply adapted. New criminal groups emerged, more decentralized and technologically advanced. Trafficking had shifted into the digital realm. What was once a physical battle was now being fought online, in encrypted chat rooms, dark web, marketplaces, and across untraceable financial networks. The rise of digital trafficking marked a chilling transformation. Syndicates used social media platforms and job recruitment websites to lure vulnerable individuals, promising them high-paying work abroad or safe housing in foreign countries. Many of these victims, like Nia, a young woman from the Philippines, were lured to Australia by the false promise of employment in salons or domestic work. Upon arrival, their passports were taken, and they were forced into labor or the sex trade. Nia's rescue came only after an undercover operation by the Australian Federal Police. Her story, though harrowing, was not uncommon. Thousands like her were still being trafficked each year, despite the fall of Ben Thomas' empire. Maria's foundation, now a major voice in global advocacy, stepped in once again, realizing that traffickers were now exploiting online platforms. Maria and fellow survivors began pushing tech companies to take responsibility for the safety of users on their platforms. Through relentless advocacy, they pressured social media giants to adopt tighter content monitoring policies and implement safeguards against recruitment tactics used by traffickers. Meanwhile, the Australian government ramped up its digital defense strategy. It partnered with international law enforcement bodies and NGOs to form a new global framework for detecting, tracking, and prosecuting online human trafficking operations. Organizations like the United Nations and Interpol became key allies in a global crackdown on digital exploitation. Yet even with all these advances, survivors like Maria knew the war was far from over. As long as poverty, displacement, and vulnerability existed, so too would traffickers, seeking to exploit them. One particularly haunting reminder of this ongoing battle was the expansion of trafficking within Australia's own borders. Maria's foundation began working with at-risk communities, indigenous populations, migrants, and low-income families, educating them on the warning signs of trafficking and offering resources for prevention, protection, and recovery. Survivors of Ben's network weren't just symbols of resilience, they had become the architects of a new movement. Their voices redefined how the world viewed recovery, justice, and long-term support. They reminded society that dismantling a trafficking empire was only the first step. True progress required rebuilding lives, and slowly, that progress came. Global trafficking statistics began to show a modest but meaningful decline. Countries began adopting Australia's survivor-centered model, and Ben Thomas, once a name whispered in fear, became a symbol of what happens when justice, advocacy, and global collaboration are aligned. The trauma of trafficking may never fully vanish. For many survivors, healing is lifelong, but they were no longer silent, no longer invisible. The movement they had started was gaining strength, one voice, one policy, one rescued life at a time. Case 5. Edward Graves. The gentleman trafficker Edward Graves was a man of unassuming appearance. His calm demeanor, a calculated blend of charisma and quiet menace. To the public, he was a discreet businessman, reserved, impeccably dressed, always carrying himself with poise. But behind that polished facade, Graves was the mastermind of one of the most insidious criminal syndicates in modern British history. He moved in shadows, pulling strings that few even knew existed, manipulating people and institutions alike to serve his growing empire. Graves could just as easily slip into a high-level boardroom as he could into a back alley where deals were whispered and lives were bought and sold. Born on the outskirts of London into poverty and instability, his early years were shaped by crime and addiction. He witnessed firsthand how drugs could destroy families, watching people he loved spiral into hopelessness. But instead of turning him away from that world, it gave him a disturbing insight. True power came from controlling both the poison and the people desperate enough to use it. As he rose through the ranks of the underworld, Graves built a vast network that, by the mid-2000s, extended well beyond the streets of London. His operation had grown into a transnational machine, with direct ties to drug cartels in South America and Asia. Heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, he trafficked them all, each shipment adding to his ever-growing fortune. But drugs were only part of the story. Graves saw people not as individuals, but as assets. The same pipelines that moved narcotics across continents were used to traffic human lives, men, women, and children from war-torn nations and desperate regions lured in with false promises of opportunity. In the UK, they were told they'd find work and safety. What awaited them was captivity. Victims were smuggled into the country, then stripped of their passports, their freedom, and in many cases, their identities. Women were forced into brothels. Men labored on construction sites or in sweatshops. Some were sold into domestic servitude. Graves' enforcers kept them under constant watch, isolated, threatened, invisible. Graves himself never got his hands dirty. He stayed in the background, coordinating through layers of intermediaries and loyal lieutenants. He bribed immigration officials, border agents, and port authorities, ensuring that shipments, both human and narcotic, moved undetected. His ability to remain insulated was the key to his empire's longevity. But in 2010, his walls began to crack. A routine investigation into drug trafficking led to a seemingly minor tip: an incoming heroin shipment flagged at a UK port. What appeared at first to be a standard narcotics case quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. Investigators uncovered fragments of a sprawling human trafficking operation, with Edward Graves at the center. As detectives followed the threads, the true scale of his empire emerged. His network stretched deep into Europe, where vulnerable individuals were recruited and funneled into the UK. It reached into Asia, where young women were deceived with job offers and then sold into the sex trade. Thousands of lives had been impacted, and the drugs trafficked were valued in the billions. Behind the curtain, Graves' organization ran like a corporation. His lieutenants oversaw recruitment, transport, and distribution, each handling a specific aspect of the operation with brutal efficiency. And all of it fed back to one man. In 2011, British authorities launched a series of coordinated raids across the country, targeting brothels, safe houses, warehouses, and laundering fronts tied to the syndicate. Dozens were arrested, including many of Graves' top enforcers. But Graves himself had vanished. For months, he lived on the run, assuming false identities, moving through countries with counterfeit documents, using burner phones and encrypted channels to stay connected. But the pressure was mounting. Interpol, Europol, and British intelligence worked in tandem, tracking financial records, phone pings, and border movements. Then, in the summer of 2012, the chase came to an end. A tip from an informant led authorities to a quiet estate in the English countryside. When officers raided the property in the dead of night, they found Graves, alone, bags packed, car idling, ready to flee. He was arrested without resistance. The trial of Edward Graves became a national spectacle. The media dubbed him the gentleman trafficker. Survivors gave harrowing testimony, stories of forced labor, rape, starvation, and psychological torment. Their voices exposed the unimaginable horrors that had unfolded under the protection of his empire in 2013. Graves was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The court called his crimes systematic, calculated, and inhumane. His arrest marked the official collapse of his syndicate, but the damage, deep, lasting, and irreversible, had already been done. The investigation into Graves' operation did more than bring down a kingpin. It exposed a system riddled with corruption. Officials tasked with protecting borders had been bought. Agencies meant to shield the vulnerable had failed. The case ignited a national and international reckoning over how trafficking networks thrive in the cracks between law, profit, and human desperation. Even after Graves was locked away, the ripple effects of his actions were felt for years. His story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that modern trafficking isn't confined to back alleys. It wears suits, shakes hands, and moves through global finance like any Fortune 500 company. The survivors of his empire, once voiceless, began to rebuild. Many became advocates. Some testified in future cases. Others founded support networks for victims of trafficking. They refused to be reduced to statistics. Asterisk. They were survivors, and their stories ensured that the darkness Edward Graves unleashed would never be forgotten. Case 5. Edward Graves, the Ghost. Kingpin Edward Graves had cultivated deep ties within both the legal and illegal sectors, ensuring his operations continued undetected for years. Known for his cold, calculating demeanor, Graves always planned 2 or 3 steps ahead, staying just out of reach of law enforcement. But as the investigation into his empire unfolded, it became alarmingly clear. Graves wasn't just another drug trafficker. His reach extended into every crevice of international crime. One of the most shocking revelations was the involvement of corrupt government officials across several nations. Many had been on his payroll for years, turning a blind eye as drugs and human lives flowed across borders. Graves had built an entire infrastructure, complete with fake businesses, shell corporations, and bribed authorities to smuggle not only narcotics, but people. Victims often came from regions where hope had withered, war-torn parts of the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Africa. Graves' recruiters preyed on the desperate, offering promises of safety, jobs, and opportunity in the United Kingdom. But those promises were a trap. Once ensnared, victims were funneled through illegal channels, hidden in safe houses, and eventually sold into sex work, forced labor, or modern-day slavery, always under the threat of violence. It wasn't until international law enforcement agencies joined forces that the full horror of Graves' trafficking empire came into view. What they uncovered was a global web of exploitation, powered by alliances with criminal organizations across continents. But what truly disturbed investigators was the scale of human suffering. Thousands of men, women, and children's lives commodified and discarded. Graves didn't just deal in heroin and cocaine, he weaponized addiction. His drugs flooded the most vulnerable communities in the UK, creating cycles of dependence he could control. As long as people craved their next high, they were tethered to him. His vast dealer network kept the streets supplied, keeping entire neighborhoods under his thumb. But it was his human trafficking enterprise that revealed the full depth of his depravity. He didn't just profit from suffering, he engineered it. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered how meticulous Graves had been. Surveillance footage, wiretaps, and phone records showed a man obsessed with secrecy. He rarely dealt with anyone directly, relying on layers of intermediaries. If one link was compromised, it wouldn't lead back to him. This structure made it nearly impossible to tie him to any single crime. But then came the break investigators desperately needed. One of Graves' most trusted lieutenants, Michael Hawk, had reached a breaking point. For years, Hawk had helped recruit victims from abroad and witnessed firsthand the atrocities committed in Graves' name. Guilt began to gnaw at him. He could no longer ignore the shattered lives or the screams that haunted him. In the dead of night, Hawk reached out to authorities. He offered full cooperation in exchange for immunity, fully aware that betraying Graves could cost him his life. With trembling hands, he laid bare the syndicate's inner workings, its smuggling routes, its money laundering, its recruitment practices. Hawk's testimony became the key that unlocked Graves' empire. With his help, law enforcement launched a sweeping crackdown. High-profile arrests and coordinated raids unfolded across the UK and abroad. Piece by piece, Graves' organization was dismantled, but the man himself remained elusive. The investigation became a race against time. Authorities knew if they didn't catch Graves soon, the operation could regroup. For every lieutenant arrested, 2 more seemed ready to take their place. But Graves made a fatal miscalculation. He underestimated the investigators' resolve. They had studied his methods, mapped out his network, and severed his layers of protection. By spring 2012, the walls finally closed in. That April, a team of armed officers stormed a secluded private estate on the outskirts of London, Graves' last sanctuary. The mansion, surrounded by gates and dense foliage, had served as his hideout. But the raid was swift and surgical. Within minutes, Graves was in custody. He offered no resistance. Cold and expressionless, he was led away silent as ever. For the officers, it was the culmination of years of tireless work. For the victims, it was both a triumph and a tragedy. Graves was behind bars, but their wounds would take a lifetime to heal. Graves' trial was anything but straightforward. He used his vast resources to assemble a formidable legal team, one skilled in discrediting evidence and dragging out proceedings. The defense painted him as an unwitting businessman caught up in criminal activity beyond his control. They questioned the credibility of former associates like Hawk, suggesting that their cooperation was motivated by self-preservation, not truth. But the prosecution fought back, armed with wiretaps, surveillance footage, financial records, and first-hand testimonies. Day by day, they dismantled the myth of Edward Graves. Witnesses told stories of torture, rape, and unspeakable suffering. Shipments were traced, shell companies exposed, and timelines reconstructed. The defense crumbled ultimately. The jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all major counts including drug trafficking, human trafficking, conspiracy, and organized crime. Graves was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole, but perhaps more powerful than the sentence itself was what followed. Victims were finally given the opportunity to speak, to confront the man who had commodified their existence. One by one, they stepped forward in court, their voices shaking but firm, recounting what Graves had stolen from them. Their testimonies didn't just close the chapter, they gave it meaning. Edward Graves will spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, but his story, his crimes will remain a haunting reminder. When greed meets power, and human life becomes just another product to trade, the cost is always paid in blood and silence, until someone chooses to break it. Photographs alone couldn't capture the full horror behind Edward Graves' empire. It was the testimonies of survivors, those rescued from his vast human trafficking operation, that truly revealed the darkness at its core. These were individuals who had once lost all hope, lured by false promises of a better life in the UK, only to be imprisoned, starved, and subjected to unspeakable abuse. Locked in windowless rooms, threatened daily, and stripped of their dignity. They were treated not as people but as property. Some victims had been trafficked as children, others forced into the sex trade. Their voices, raw, emotional, and unflinching, became the heartbeat of the prosecution's case. For the first time, the courtroom heard the truth directly from those who had lived it. But Graves' crimes didn't end at Britain's borders. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a vast international network that spanned multiple continents. His trafficking ring stretched across Poland, Nigeria, Albania, Mexico, Cambodia, and beyond. Each location acted as a node in a sophisticated, global system designed to smuggle not just drugs but human lives. Graves disguised his criminal enterprise beneath layers of legitimacy. Agricultural exports, industrial machinery, and textile shipments all served as cover. In one harrowing instance, authorities intercepted shipping containers filled with supposed textiles. Inside were hidden compartments of cocaine, and worse, human beings locked in cages, bound for exploitation in the UK. Graves' victims weren't just used for sex trafficking. Many were forced into bonded labor in illegal sweatshops, producing counterfeit goods. Others were coerced into performing in underground gambling rings. The sheer scale of exploitation was staggering. To Graves, people were nothing more than currency, each life reduced to a cold calculation. Each body just another commodity. Perhaps most chilling of all was the discovery of training camps in remote parts of the UK. Here, Graves groomed young recruits to become enforcers, smugglers, and silent operators in his vast machine. Stripped of their identities, paid nothing, and constantly threatened with violence, these young people were brainwashed into maintaining the secrecy of his operation. As the trial unfolded, the defense team began to falter. The overwhelming evidence combined with the survivors' courageous testimonies left little room for rebuttal. Graves, once thought untouchable, could no longer hide behind expensive attorneys or the web of intermediaries that had long shielded him. In the courtroom, survivors sat together in the front row, no longer victims, but witnesses to justice. They had come not just to testify, but to reclaim power, to speak for those still trapped in the shadows of Graves' empire. When the prosecution delivered its closing arguments, the gravity of the moment was unmistakable. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the judge prepared to announce the verdict. It was a silence filled with pain, but also with hope. Then, the words were spoken. Edward Graves, you have been found guilty of multiple counts of human trafficking, drug smuggling, conspiracy, and exploitation. The evidence against you is irrefutable. You have destroyed countless lives for personal gain. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The weight of the ruling hit hard. Survivors wept, some silently, others openly. Some simply sat still, stunned that justice had finally come. The courtroom, once a place of fear for them, became a symbol of their resilience. Graves' vast criminal empire, built on pain, coercion, and greed, had finally crumbled. But the aftermath of his crimes would echo for years. Thousands of lives had been upended, entire families torn apart. Yet in that moment, something powerful had been reclaimed: freedom. While Edward Graves began his life sentence in isolation, the survivors began their journey back into the light. Healing would take time. For many, the scars would never fully fade, but they had reclaimed their stories. They were no longer victims, they were survivors. Asterisk. Even with Graves behind bars, remnants of his empire lingered. His networks had reached too far, embedded too deeply, but his downfall sent a message. Silence would no longer be an option, and those he had tried to silence were now the loudest voices in the fight against human trafficking. In the years that followed, Graves became more than a criminal. He became a cautionary tale. His story, once one of ambition and dominance, was now a grim reminder of how unchecked power can turn monstrous. But more importantly, it was a testament to human resilience and the unbreakable will of those who had once been broken. Because in the end, Edward Graves lost everything, but his victims, they found something far more powerful: their voices, their justice, and, at last, their freedom. Life after the trafficking system was a daunting and unfamiliar path. For many of Edward Graves' victims, some of whom had been trafficked for years, freedom didn't come with ease. Normalcy had become a foreign concept. They had spent so long living in fear, under the control of a man who had stripped them of their dignity, their autonomy, and their very identities. Now, with Graves imprisoned and his empire dismantled, they were free. But what did that mean? Freedom, as many would discover, wasn't the simple blessing others imagined it to be. For some survivors, the scars ran deep emotional wounds that no court verdict could ever fully heal. The trauma they endured within the hidden corridors of Graves' trafficking network continued to shadow every part of their lives. Trust was difficult. Relationships were fraught with fear. The threat of being dragged back into the darkness loomed constantly in the back of their minds, like an echo they couldn't silence. But amidst the pain, there was also hope. As more victims came forward, they found solidarity in shared experience. Survivors began to form a community, one built not on what they had suffered, but on the strength it took to survive it. They supported each other, shoulder to shoulder, through group therapy sessions, rehabilitation programs, and grassroots networks spanning the UK and across Europe. One of the most powerful parts of the healing process was the transformation of their narratives from stories of victimhood to stories of resilience. Many survivors made the courageous decision to speak publicly, turning their pain into purpose. They shared their journeys through documentaries, interviews, conferences, and public forums, raising awareness and ensuring Graves' crimes would never be forgotten. More importantly, they aimed to protect others, to be the warning, the signal, flare, the voice for those still trapped. These brave individuals became the face of a growing movement against human trafficking. Their voices carried beyond the courtroom and into the conscience of the world, while survivors focused on reclaiming their lives. Law enforcement continued the fight to dismantle what was left of Graves' criminal empire. Though he was locked away, the damage he'd done remained. His vast network had left behind a trail of chaos that couldn't be undone overnight. Investigations uncovered deeper links to global drug cartels, organized crime syndicates, and even corrupt officials who had chosen to look the other way. Graves' influence, though weakened, still haunted the darker corners of society, and the fight to erase his legacy was far from over. With Graves gone, the drug routes he once controlled were seized by new players eager to capitalize on the power vacuum. The flow of cocaine and heroin into the UK persisted. Graves had been a major figure in the British drug trade, and his fall had sent shockwaves through the underworld. But crime, like nature, abhors a vacuum, and others were quick to step in. Despite this, UK authorities and international law enforcement agencies remained resolute. They began targeting the middlemen, the enablers, traffickers, and smugglers, who had once operated in Graves' shadow. Without his protection, many were left scrambling. Over the following years, several key operatives were captured and brought to justice. In the midst of these developments, one survivor took a remarkable step forward. Clara, whose story of survival had already inspired many, founded a non-profit organization called Reclaiming Freedom. Its mission was simple, yet profound: to provide long-term support to survivors of trafficking, raise awareness, and offer real resources to help those struggling to rebuild their lives. Clara understood, what few others could, that liberation wasn't just about escaping physical captivity. It was about healing, empowerment, and restoration. Her nonprofit quickly gained momentum, drawing support from philanthropists, lawmakers, and international advocacy groups. Clara became a prominent voice in the global fight against human trafficking, speaking at summits, working with NGOs, and even advising governments across Europe and Asia. She turned her deepest wounds into tools for change, and in doing so, she helped reshape the fight for justice on a worldwide scale. The survivors of Graves' empire became a tight-knit group, united by shared trauma and a common goal: to make sure what happened to them would never happen again. They met regularly, both online and in person, offering each other support, strength, and solidarity. These gatherings became sacred spaces of healing and truth, where no one had to explain their pain, because everyone understood. Years later, as efforts to eliminate human trafficking expanded, Clara found herself at a crossroads. She had spent so much time fighting for others that she had neglected her own recovery. Her work had been vital, but the toll it took was undeniable. In a quiet moment of reflection, she made the difficult choice to step back from the spotlight. She needed time not to fight, but to feel, to finally begin healing from within. She withdrew from public life and focused on herself, therapy, community support, and the simple joys that had once been stolen from her slowly became part of her life again. She surrounded herself with loved ones. She laughed, she cried, she rested. And in that space of stillness, Clara realized just how far she had come. The young woman once imprisoned in silence and fear had become a global force for change. Her transformation, born of pain, carved by courage, stood as a beacon for survivors everywhere. As time went on, Clara and her fellow survivors remained at the forefront of the battle. They had lived through hell, but they had emerged not just alive but victorious. Their voices, once silenced, now rang out in unison. They demanded justice, compassion, and a future free from exploitation. The journey, however, was far from over. The fight would continue until no one else had to suffer the way they had. The survivors of Graves' empire were living proof that even the darkest stories could be rewritten, that even the most shattered lives could be pieced back together, and that victory and hard-fought didn't belong to them alone. It belonged to all who still waited for the day they too could be free.